Good rainy day to you. This morning, as I'm sitting in my office, we're getting quite a rain shower this morning. It seems like it's going to continue through the rest of the morning, if not into the afternoon. And we're thankful to God for that, are we not? As we've needed some rain. And so He's providing. Uh, I'm back in the saddle now. I've been gone for the last two Wednesdays. And where we have gone, I've somewhat been in the digital black hole and didn't have um, a way or an opportunity to record these lessons from the Psalms for you. And so we're back with it today into the 11th Psalm. But it was kind of nice to be away from the pressures of the ministry, to be with my mother-in-law and get some work done around her place as we anticipate the onslaught of winter. But I'm excited to be able to doing this again. And so we're looking at the 11th Psalm today, and that's a relatively short one. And so you might think we'll have a relatively short lesson in it this morning. Maybe, maybe not. But I'll give you a moment to get your Bibles if you haven't got them, and get them open to the 11th Psalm. We might start just with a question here as I have a sip of coffee. For you, do troubles in your life, do crises in your life, do hard situations in your life sometimes make you feel just like running away? To just get away from it all. Now, sometimes our vacation is like that, right? That we kind of get away from our day-to-day routine and activities, and we're out having a good time. Maybe we're with family, maybe friends, maybe we're at a place we've never been to before. And it is good. It's good to get away from the daily tasks and routine, but you always have to come back. The question I'm asking today, and I keep wanting to say this morning, but I don't know what time of day you may be listening to this. The question that I'm asking has to do with just drop it, get out of town, get out of Dodge, and never go back. Trying to get away from the troubles and things that bring trial into our lives. When those things happen, I read yesterday that the number of infections from COVID-19 are actually going down all over the United States. That's a wonderful thing. But we've had to deal with that, and to some degree, people are still having to deal with that, and in some cases, people are still dying from COVID-19. And there's other things that are going on in our world, both as a nation and globally, that impact us. And then there's things that come to us individually. Maybe the death of a loved one, maybe a loss of a job and you can't pay your bills, and maybe the mortgage is coming due, or you can't pay for your electric bill or whatever. Maybe your family's become somewhat dysfunctional. Maybe there's divorce, things like that. That sometimes maybe we feel like just walking away from. And that's really what the psalmist is speaking to today in the 11th Psalm. Because David is getting some advice. As we've mentioned, David has trouble in his life. There are people who are out to get him, mostly under the leadership of King Saul, who's trying to kill David. And he's having to run hide. And you read about that in the narrative about David's life. And so David is getting, now I don't know whether he's literally getting this advice or he feels like this is the advice he's being given, and that is to just run away. And so get your Bibles, and as we have been, let's do an overview of this psalm, and that's not going to take very long this morning either, because I've only divided it into two sections. The first section is simply verses 1 through 3, and this is the advice to flee. David, excuse me, David, just get out of Dodge. Leave all this behind you. I suppose David could do that. He could just go to a totally new country, but you know, he tried that one time. If you remember, he went to join himself to the Philistines, and that only lasted for a while, and it didn't solve the problem. And so verses 1 through 3 are an advisory committee, if you please, that's telling David to flee. And then verses 4, 5, 6, and 7 are, no, David, no, let's remain and let's just see how God is going to bring about resolution to this particular issue or multiple issues that he's having to deal with in his life. And so we come to that, and I think we need maybe to relate this to our own life as we read it. You know, there would be people who would tell us in the middle of our strife that, hey, you don't have to deal with that, just get out of it. And so marriages are dissolved because of that, and let me hasten to say that no one has to stay in a marriage where there's a high level of abuse or anything like that. And of course, for unfaithfulness, the Lord permits the dissolving of a marriage. But fundamentally, if every little thing in your marriage is not going just exactly like you think it ought to, that's not necessarily time to think about dissolving the marriage. Maybe a job at work. Well, I guess there's a time when maybe you might need to leave that job, but not at every little turn. And whatever other issues that we might be failing, that it's maybe not time to turn and run, but to maybe, like we've never done before, turn to God. So let's read these short 7 verses of Psalm 11. Mine has the superscription of to the choir master of David. So this is really a song. And let me just remind us of that fundamentally the Psalms were songs that were sung in what we might describe as the worship service, okay, of the Jews. It wasn't so much like our worship service today, but it was theirs. And some of these psalms were songs that were sung by, and I'll use the word congregation, the assembly, and some were sung by the priests, and some were sung back and forth. One group would sing a part, and then another group would jump in with the next part, and the other group would come back, and those are called the antiphonal psalms. And so this just says to the choir master. So the individual, the priest, maybe it was a Levite who was somewhat in charge of the singers, would bring this psalm to his group of singers, and they would sing it for whatever assembly. We somewhat have a song that we have sung as a church, although I haven't heard it in a long, long time. And it comes from the latter part of verse 1. So let's read the psalm, and then we'll come back to that, okay? So Psalm 11, to the choir master of David. In the Lord I take refuge. How can you say to my soul, flee like a bird to your mountain? For behold, the wicked bend the bow. They have fitted their arrow to the string to shoot in the dark at the upright in heart. If the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? The Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord's throne is in heaven. His eyes see, his eyelids test the children of man. The Lord tests the righteous, but his soul hates the wicked and the one who loves violence. Let him rain coals on the wicked. Fire and sulfur and a scorching wind shall be the portion of their cup. For the Lord is righteous. He loves righteous deeds. The upright shall behold his face. Well, this psalm may cause maybe some misunderstanding at times. But I mentioned that we used to have a song we sang called Flee as a Bird to Your Mountain. Flee as a bird to your mountain, O thou who art weary of sin. I haven't sung that in a long time. I'm not sure that that's exactly what the psalmist is saying here, because here David is saying the advice I'm getting is to run away. And his advisors apparently are giving him some reasons why he ought to run away. And basically it's because there's people that are after you. But look how they're described. They're hiding in the shadows. They're out there in the darkness and they're taking shots at him. It just almost as if, David, it's coming and you don't know it's coming. You can't even see that it's coming. You can't even see your enemies, the ones who are after you. It's very sinister. It's very cloak and dagger. It's David, this is hard to see. The best thing you could do is just leave. Maybe we might agree with that advice. Well, we do know this from David's life. He tried many times to flee, to get away, and people were still after him, so it didn't solve anything. And if we try to run from our problems and issues in our lives, it doesn't solve anything, and typically we're going to be found out. And all these problems and issues are going to come right back to us. Maybe twofold, threefold, fourfold worse than they were. And there's no reason for a child of God, a Christian, to feel like they have to flee. That, to some degree, is showing an inordinate distrust in God. You know, when I read these first few verses here, I see the darkness that's out there, and I'm going to be preaching about darkness this coming Sunday morning, as we begin a thread through the tapestry of John, the thread of darkness. But so much is done in the darkness and in hiding. Did you know that the number of violent crimes against citizens is highest between 3 and 4 a.m. in the morning? Because it's dark. People are in bed. They're asleep. And so those who would perpetrate such things are likely to get away with it. And so as David says here, you know, you're advising me to leave, and you're saying that they shoot in the dark at the upright in heart. And maybe that's right. We know that David continually had people after him, and they would come after him from whatever quarter was available to them to try to kill David. And so as David sat back and listened to this advice, he could say, you know, they're right. Let me just get out of here. But that would be a demonstration of a lack of trust in God. And so David is going to deal with that advice in essence by saying, if I do that, that means I don't trust God. I don't trust God to see me through that. And I might stop and say something here about that. That most of the time when we find ourselves in problematic times in our lives and dealing with issues and trouble and things like that, we design how we think this should resolve itself. In other words, we're doing our own thinking here. when in reality, as God walks with us through it, and please understand that, as He walks with us through this, the end result may not be a resolution that we thought of. It might be better in different ways. And so our confidence needs to be not in how God is going to do this according to what I think He should do. Our confidence should be simply in that God is walking with us through this. And so the first thing David is going to say here is that the Lord is in His holy temple. The Lord is in His holy temple. That phrase is repeated several times in the Psalms and other books, especially of prophecy in the Bible. A reference to the fact that God is present where He's supposed to be, where we anticipate that He is. And the Lord is in His holy temple. And it's kind of interesting that the first thing David says in this psalm is, I take refuge in Him. I take refuge in the Lord. And that's a summary statement that follows or finds itself at the end of several of his psalms. And in those psalms, he describes for us his dangers and his problems, and people are after him, and what are you going to do, God? And he'll close with, but in you, God, do I take refuge. In this psalm, he starts with that. And that kind of sets the stage here. If you're going to take refuge in God, then you're not going to listen to those who say, get out of here. But rather now, taking refuge in God, you're going to allow Him to work in the situation to bring it to a proper resolution. David's going to address this issue of running away maybe along three lines. And one of them is, one line is theological. It's a theological truth, okay? That God is in His holy temple. The Lord's throne is in heaven. And so he addresses the theology of the presence of God. And the temple represented that for the Jews, right? That's where God was present. And then it becomes a metaphor for you and for me as Christians, as children of God, that He is present. You know, your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit, right? God's present. The church is the metaphoric temple of God's people, and God is present. In reality, the entire universe is God's temple, and He is present. And so David reminds himself, as well as us, of the presence of God in the middle of his problems and in the middle of the people telling him, just turn and run. That's where God is. Then secondly, he's going to approach this issue, this thing of running away from a practical standpoint. We might call it practical. As he says, and let's read this at the end of verse 4 and then verse 5, his eyes see, his eyelids test the children of men. The Lord tests the righteous, but his soul hates the wicked and the one who loves violence. I'm not sure the word test there is a good way, a good understanding of this word. Maybe examine or looks closely. So he looks closely at what's going on in our lives. In other words, he knows what's going on. He knows what's happening in your life. He knows what's happening in my life. He knows the people in my life who don't like me and maybe even are out to get me. And he knows those about you too. And so the Lord sees that and examines hearts. He's always been a heart examiner. He knows what's in our heart, and he knows what's in the hearts of the other people. And the Lord sees that, and he hates those who do violence. He is against those who are wicked. If you are a child of God, he's all for you. And the Lord discerns all of that. And so that helps David to remember, and it helps us to remember to put ourselves in the right place, which is with God who knows. And so God is not finding out anything he doesn't know. Okay? He already knows. He's done the examination. And then David's going to tackle this problem from a purely spiritual aspect. So he's he's thought about it from a theological aspect, the presence of God everywhere. He's thought about it from a practical standpoint. God knows. Okay, God knows. And then the third one is a spiritual approach here, as he sums up the entire psalm. For the Lord is righteous. He loves righteous deeds, and the upright shall behold his face. And so the solution for David is that if he indeed is righteous, and he is, that the presence of God is such, and he uses the term behold his face, and I don't think he's talking about when he dies, but beholding the presence of God, being aware that God is with us, watching us, looking over us, protecting us, doing things his way in our lives, that's what you need to remember. You know, I know that people today are dealing with difficult things. We just had one member overnight that passed away, and such a lovely lady. And that's going to bring some sadness into that family, and I think that's rightly so, and we might need to talk about grief sometime. But the family and friends of that dear lady need to know that God hasn't left them, and that in reality what has happened to her is a part of life, and God has said so. And this wonderful Christian lady died very faithful. So beholding God's face becomes such a beautiful, yes, but an important and powerful statement about the relationship that God maintains, has with his people, even during the tough times, and even during the times when the devil, coming through people, is speaking falsehood or bad advice to us. And that happens too. I hope you have a blessed Wednesday and enjoy this rain that we've needed so badly. And we will look forward next week to moving on to the 12th Psalm.